don't know me, I'm Sophia McClennen. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies and also professor here in the School of International Affairs. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Lior Sternfeld and Wali Ahmadi organizing this symposium. The Center for Global Studies staff has done a ton of work, so if you get a moment, say thank you to them. This morning, it's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Sarah Chayes. I will simply start by saying I am a tremendous fan of her writing, and there was the first time I read her stuff, I thought, I just want to grow up and be like her. So she is a real role model for me. Sarah Chayes is internationally known for her innovative thinking on corruption and its global implications. She got her start on this issue during a decade-long stint in Kandahar, starting in December 2001, when she covered the fall of the Taliban for NPR. Having learned to speak Pashto, she helped rebuild homes and set up a dairy cooperative. In May 2005, she established the Arghand cooperative, which made high-end skincare products from illicit local agriculture. And she next published The Punishment of Virtue, which examined misguided US policy in Afghanistan in the wake of the defeat of the Taliban. Chayes reveals that US policy severely undermined the effort to build democracy and allowed corrupt tribal warlords back into positions of power and the Taliban to re-infiltrate the country. At the time her book came out, she was one of the very few brave enough to question US policy and defend the integrity of certain members of the Afghan community. I'll remind you, for example, at that exact time, Michael Moore won an Oscar for Fahrenheit 9/11 and was literally booed off the Oscar stage. This was how uncool it was to be critical of the US government in any way. Sarah went on to serve as a special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and is the author of 2 books on corruption, Thieves of State and On Corruption in America. And in fact, we have some of her work to buy if you're interested, and I think she'd be more than happy to give you her signature. So with that, please join me in offering her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Sophia. And you guys don't know, but I rewrote that introduction like right then and there in sloppy handwriting. So that was a brilliant job. And I also really want to thank all the organizers and all of you. I mean, it is 9 o'clock or 9:15 on a Saturday morning, and you're out here and it's 35 degrees out. So thanks a lot for being here. And I also heard no sleep last night. And, you know, this is a difficult issue for all of us who have spent, you know, our hearts on it. And the emotions are strong and they can take strange forms. They can keep you up at night. They can, you know, take the form of cynical laughter. So bear with me as my blood pressure, you know, goes up and down. But this is, now, I'm assuming that, do I do that? Yes, okay. So I'm gonna try to take, yeah. Like I said, right? Okay. Now, that's less important than getting this to go away. Let's get that to go away, and that to go away, and that to go away. More.
Leave the calculator.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Just a second.
So, yeah. So I just want to sort of launch the day by getting quite serious about about the global perspective here, and just placing Afghanistan both historically and geographically in a just illuminating a little bit its place in the world, which has something to do with why it has been fought over for so long. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a hook and go through some parallels with another current global crisis. So the most important asset in terms of material economic asset of Afghanistan is not even rare minerals, certainly not hydrocarbons. It is its place. It's where it physically sits in the world. Because essentially, if you look at this, and we're going to come in a little bit closer, you see that there's kind of a wall separating three great basins of civilization. And they are Central Asia. Let's see, maybe I can do it here like that. Can you see the cursor? Yeah. Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the Iranian plateau. So Afghanistan sits on the wall dividing them, and it sits on two doors in that wall. So let's just take a look. Here are the two doors, right? The two famous passes, Khyber and Bolan. That is irreplaceable geography. What are some of the historical, political consequences of that? Back in the Seleucid Empire, the days of the Seleucid Empire, that's Alexander's descendants, right? Right here, you notice this interesting, weird color? Well, this used to be part of the Seleucid Empire, but it was sold, allegedly, to the Mauryan Empire in the Indian subcontinent for what? 500 elephants, for war elephants, basically for, military military hardware. Safavi and the Mughals. You see the siege of Kandahar. Of course, I'm a little bit Kandahar centric because that's where I lived for a decade. So I focus a little bit more on that area. But this area, if you look through historical maps of the Seleucid Empire, you'll see this area switching hands back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, right? And so again, it is this absolutely crucial gateway across an almost impenetrable wall that is so incredibly important. Durant Line, the famous Durant Line, right? Which has been a matter of dispute since it was drawn in the late 19th century. So there again are our two gateways through this wall. Again, just to give us the global perspective, look how critical that placement is in terms of the geography, even without the topography being added. Okay, so now I'm going to offer a provocative parallel to a current global crisis. I'm not trying to say here that topography, I'm not determinist, right? That topography determines history, but it certainly plays a role. I think particularly where you have mountainous regions like this, and particularly where you're on a cusp between these different basins of civilization, it's really fascinating because you often get both the sort of scrappy, violent past, but you also get these incredible, unique civilizations that are multi often multi-ethnic, multicultural, and often very democratic. I'm thinking what I have in mind also is the Albania, Slavic, that cusp right there too. And then you've got this one. I'm going to suggest that there is a parallel. And those tests we all took in high school, A is to B as, So Pakistan is to Afghanistan as Russia is to Ukraine, is what I'm going to suggest here. Now, to start as a kind of groundwork, and I'm not sure how much of this I'm going to need to go into for this expert audience, but there is a myth to the effect that the Taliban arose in Kandahar. How many people have heard that myth? Not myth, a fallacy. I believe in myths. Myths are very important. Myths are truth, they're not falsehood. Fallacies. Fallacy is the word I'm looking for. How many of you have heard that story? Yeah, I mean, we've all heard the story, right? Let me just lay out here that is not how it happened. And I spent months and months interviewing people in the places, not for a radio story, but because I lived there and I wanted to know. And I did write it into Punishment of Virtue, what I found. And what I found is that is not what happened. What happened is the Taliban were essentially concocted in madrasas across the border in Pakistan and were essentially put together by the Pakistani ISI, the military intelligence agency, and then were sent across the border. Not only that, but the ISI actually conducted market research ahead of this move in precisely the areas where later the Taliban were supposedly arose. That is to say, to the west, slightly north, but mostly west of Kandahar city proper in those villages along the road that leads to Herat. And I talked to those folks and they told me that people came around and said, how would you feel if a bunch of Taliban, that is to say religious students, came and, brought the warlords to heel? Because at the time in Kandahar, the local level violent extortion that a bunch of people who had just been living for 15 or 20 years by force of arms, who essentially were suffering, if you will, collective PTSD, and kind of didn't know how to reintegrate a civilian society. And so they sort of put their military skills to work in a criminal career, shaking people down. They were wreaking havoc in this city. And I remember asking someone, wait, was Gullah Shirzai governor of Kandahar at this time? And being told, yeah, Gullah Shirzai was governor in the governor's palace, but so-and-so was governor over there, and so-and-so was governor over there. And if you had 5 guys in the street corner, you were governor of your street corner. And that's what it was like. I didn't know a single person who had not been violently treated at the hands of these people who had their chains across the road. So the ISI sends people out to say, how would you feel if a bunch of religious students came and took the chains down? At the time, religious students, Taliban, had a terrifically positive reputation in the area because they were typically basically almost like Franciscans. They were begging, essentially subsistence level young men who studied religion at the feet of a mullah, of a village mullah. And they lived on the generous donations of their neighbors in the village, and that's who they were. So it had a terrifically positive, it's sort of like the Soviet Union using the word communism for, you know, an autocratic state. You use a word that has a very positive connotation and apply it to something else. So that is how the Taliban arose. There's also an incredibly interesting story about the role of Ahmed Karzai in all of this, in bringing the Taliban to town, and the role of someone who became a dear friend of mine, Mullah Naqib, Mullah Gulahund. And he accepted, Karzai came to him, he basically owned the northern part of the city. He had been responsible for driving the Soviets out. And Karzai came to him and said, you know, again, let's let these Taliban in because, and he said, I couldn't control my own men. My men were causing harm to my neighbors. And so I said, yeah, he felt terrible about it, but he basically opened the road. So all of that story is in The Punishment of Virtue. So I just wanted to give, I'm not sure, as I say, I'm not sure I needed to give you that background, but I wanted to have that established. Then let me tell you that I watched the ISI gin the Taliban back up, starting really in about 2005. The first assassination happened in 2003, but they couldn't even stay inside Afghanistan. They were kicked out, like they would come across the border and then, and they did something and then left. It wasn't until about 2005 that they were really able to begin to establish a foothold. And I've also got slides that I provided to the, you know, US-led military in Kabul showing the Taliban campaign plan over a number of years, because there was one. It was not random. It was a very thought out campaign plan. Anyway, so with that background, let's take a look. So you start to see now why I'm noticing a parallel here, that you have a larger neighbor that wants to take control of. Take a look at where Ukraine sits, right? There's a similarity here. It sits, it's not as mountainous, but it sits right on the cusp between two great basins of civilization, right? That's what the word means. So what you're looking at is two larger and more militarized neighbors that each of them want to take control of this absolutely strategic and culturally and politically and socially very positive and interesting borderland. In both cases, there's a kind of pseudo-historical pretext, right? The Durant Line being kind of part of it, the de facto by proxy control that Pakistan had over Afghanistan under the first rendition of the Taliban. In the case of Ukraine, there's this fantasy of Putin's that somehow the Kievan Rus, you know, was really Russia as opposed to being really Ukraine. It was a north to south. I didn't make a map of what the Kievan Rus looked like, but it's basically a north to south oblong sitting right on that cusp between the civilizations. Really important economic motivations, right? So as I said, if you're sitting on a wall or sitting on a cusp between these basins of civilization, your most important asset is these communication links. And that indeed is a lot of why the ISI ginned up the Taliban in the first place, is they couldn't get their trucks across Afghanistan either without being shaken down. So hydrocarbons being a really important one, obviously, especially in Ukraine, not unimportant in Afghanistan, and we may be looking at increasing, you know, that taking on a more and more important role. But as Roya, I think you talked about rare earth metals, did you last night? Yeah, so now we're into other natural resources that are at least as valuable, if not more valuable, than hydrocarbons. For other things, we all know the jingle trucks, right? And the stuff that I saw, because Kandahar is right on the border, so the stuff I saw, there were things like, there were no Pakistani tariffs on goods that were transiting Pakistan to go to Afghanistan. And so what often would happen was goods would transit and then be offloaded onto donkeys, which were homing donkeys, and they would go back into Pakistan. So people would avoid Pakistani tariffs by just sneaking across the border and then taking their goods back. I mean, it was ridiculous what the kinds of things that were going on. This is really important. So we've all been hearing about the grain and how devastating to the world economy, the inability to produce and especially to ship Ukrainian grain has been. Well, again, I don't think I need to tell you all this, but Afghanistan it's poor, but it is not a subsistence economy. Afghanistan, this is one of the reasons, and we'll get there in a second, why opium works so well. Afghanistan has been forever. I can't remember who sent grapes as tribute. I mean, it's like to the Babylonians. Grapes were being sent as tribute from the area of Afghanistan. So this is a place of incredibly high-end horticulture for export. And as we discussed last night, pomegranates. I mean, I've never experienced pomegranates like Kandahar pomegranates. It's the Garden of Eden is in Arghand, which is why I named my cooperative Arghand, from Arghand Ab. That's what that district is named for. Has anyone had these raisins, Kandahar raisins? These long, thin, green raisins? I saw them for sale in Watertown, Massachusetts, labeled Iranian raisins. And I said, these are not Iranian raisins, these are Afghan raisins. And the guy looked at me and he said, you're right, they're Afghan raisins, but when I had them labeled, but they were shipped to us from Iran, and when I had them labeled Afghan raisins, people didn't buy them. So I relabeled them Iranian raisins, and now they're selling. And he told me, he said, once you eat those, you don't ever want to eat another raisin in your life. And that is true. So I can get you guys the name of the store. I bet you could mail in for them. Almonds, obviously. So this is all, just as an aside, this is all what we were working with in Arghand, what we were making our skincare products from, because I started looking at the ingredients of soap, of good soap, and it's like almond oil, apricot kernel oil, and I'm like, wait a second. Wait a second. So we bought the low grade, the almonds that people had a hard time selling. Turns out there are wild almonds, de badam. There are wild almonds in that area. We bought those. We bought wild pistachios, which are about that big and peacock green. People eat them as snacks. They have we bought hemp seed and extracted oils from those, from all of it, from pomegranate seeds, because then it turns out also that, some pomegranates are damaged by the sun. And so people would take the seeds out of them and dry them, and we would wash the remaining flesh off of those seeds and take that little white seed and extract an oil from it. Arghand farmers had never seen such a thing. They couldn't believe it. So all of that stuff went into our skincare products because our idea was the problem with fruit, and we're going to get back to this problem. Sorry, the problem with fruit is heavy and perishable. you are primarily exporting this across boundaries, across national borders. Fresh fruit is heavy and perishable, which is why dried fruit is much more important to people. But this came into play in November and December of 2021, which we'll get to in a second. So we were thinking, what can we make out of the lowest grade fruit products that people have a hard time selling anyway, that is not heavy and perishable? And that's where we came up with skincare products. So there are other economic motivations too, right? And I just explained why poppy is it works so well with already the structure of Afghanistan's agricultural economy. Number one. Number two, there was at the time the issue of credit. When in 2002, there were no banks, there was no credit, there had been a drought for a long time, and you marry off your son, and it's going to cost you, $10,000 plus. You have to throw a party that everyone who knows anyone who knows you gets to come to. And so that is the major expenditure of any family. And people were going into debt to the opium trafficker, and they had to pay back in opium. And oh, guess what? If they couldn't, in other words, they had to pay back in opium, not in money. And if they couldn't, they owed twice as much, 100% interest loan the next year. So if the fields get eradicated, it's just going to expand opium production. That's a big economic motivation, and a lot of people were talking about opium as being a financial support for the returning Taliban. You know who it was really a financial support for? Members of the Afghan government, including, my original semi-benefactor, Ahmed Wali Karzai, President Karzai's younger half-brother, who was the biggest opium kingpin in southern Afghanistan, or a rival of the governor, Gul Agha Shirzai. So you had the two most important political families who were major rivals in the opium business. And that's true all over the place, that the primary, so again, then the problem was that Ahmed Wali Karzai could, with a telephone call, open the trafficking routes to opium convoys, which were often driven by Taliban, who would then drive the convoys back with weapons in the vehicles. But since the officials had been told in one direction to let the cars through, they would let them then through, going back in the other direction. So this is how you get to what I later began talking, and we're going to get to that, talking about as integrated networks of corruption. Other economic motivations. So this is really important. So in the 80s, in the Civil War period, assistance to the Mujahideen was coming into Afghanistan via Pakistan. The Pakistani Military Intelligence Agency, the ISI, was the broker for most international assistance. And then you had people like Hamid Karzai, who was the deputy foreign minister of the Mujahideen government, but was getting a lot of development contracts. And I know, because I knew the household really well, that those were not, like, the things were not being built that were supposed to be built, the money was getting pocketed. So you had basically Pakistan and its closest allies among the Afghans who were getting to be the brokers for significant inflows of military and development assistance in the 80s and 90s. So, of course, that was stopped between 2002 and 2021, right? So a an objective of the Pakistani government is to reestablish its position as the broker for a renewed inflowing of development assistance. And that's why you will see the Pakistani government and its friends, including Zalmay Khalilzad, the US negotiator of the Doha deal, screaming about how the spigots need to be opened again. Pakistan held the first donors conference. Everyone applauded this donors conference, and I'm like, are you kidding me? I mean, don't you see what's going on here? Secondly, a mercantilist relationship with the Afghan economy. What I found, starting 2002 in Kandahar, was that Afghanistan economically played the role of a colony with respect to Pakistan as the colonial power in economic terms. And by that, what I mean is, we decide we want to start manufacturing something. So I joined the manufacturers union in Kandahar, and I discovered these crazy things, like the customs regime was skewed in such a way that there was a higher tariff on raw materials coming into Afghanistan than on manufactured goods coming into Afghanistan, and vice versa. That basically you were penalized in terms of the customs regime for doing manufacturing inside Afghanistan. The other thing I learned is that there used to be significant pistachio production in Afghanistan, but during the Taliban period, Pakistanis would buy the roots of people's pistachio trees. So people were uprooting, particularly during that drought period, they were uprooting their pistachio trees. And so therefore, the objective was to have Afghanistan be exporting raw materials that Pakistan could then do the value add and gain the value add profits. The same thing is happening now. So in order to try to reestablish that mercantilist relationship. So for example, we've heard a lot since the end of 2021, since mid-2021, about the economic crisis in Afghanistan. And there is most certainly an economic crisis in Afghanistan. It's partly caused by drought. It's partly caused by, the abrupt reduction of international development assistance. But it is largely caused also by the limits on wire transfers of money. The first thing I tried to do in August of 2021 was get money to my people. You have no idea how difficult it was to get cash into the hands of 20 Afghans. It was insane. We ended up having to walk stuff. I mean, we didn't walk stuff over the border into Afghanistan, but because we couldn't use Hawala traditional money transfer system to get money, I had to walk it to England, and then it was insane what we went through to try to get money without a portion of it being held in either a bank account or held back because of the withdrawal limits, bank account or a wire service, like MoneyGram or something like that. So just by way of comparison, 11% of Pakistan's GDP is remittances from overseas. 24% of Uzbekistan's GDP is remittances from overseas. So what I'm saying is the Taliban government, beholden to the Pakistani ISI, deliberately cut its own population off from international remittances. There were gazillions. How many of you have tried to get money to your relatives back in Afghanistan? So that was a huge source of potential assistance to ordinary Afghans that the Taliban government deliberately cut its own population off from, until I think a couple of months ago. Similarly, the borders were closed to international trade. So what I heard in the late fall, early winter of 2021 is that the border at Chaman, near Kandahar, was closed to pomegranates. I mean, are you kidding me? The entire province of Kandahar depends on pomegranates. I mean, it's a mainstay of the local economy. They were dying on the trees. They were rotting on the ground. I've seen the same thing done with grapes occasionally in grape heart. There's just an arbitrary closing of the Pakistani border. And then similarly, again, this is a place of international trade, so there's cotton ginning that happens in the Afghan South. If you gin the cotton inside Afghanistan, you get, first of all, a higher price for the cotton because it's ginned, and secondly, you get the seed, and from the seed, you can both feed animals or you can extract oil. And so that's how southern Afghan cotton farmers like to do it. But what the Pakistani buyers were saying is, oh, we can't transfer any money to you until the international sanctions are lifted and blah, blah, blah. This became a pretext for no payment from Pakistani buyers. You know, and I don't know if the same thing was happening on the Iranian side because I'm not familiar with that border. But so what I'm trying to say is there was an artificially exacerbated economic pressure placed on the Afghan population. What I'm getting at here is the population was being taken hostage by the Pakistani military establishment in order to try to extract this international development. Then we come to corruption, which is been central to both of these conflicts. You know, I know we're less interested in Ukraine, but just so you know, one of the reasons Putin was appointed by Yeltsin is because he promised that he would not prosecute Yeltsin, who was under legal pressure for suspected corruption. The Maidan Revolution in Ukraine in 2014 was explicitly an anti-corruption revolution. It's being described largely as a pro-Western revolution, and now even Ukrainians are increasingly describing it that way. But if you go back at the time, it was all about the corruption of the Yanukovych regime, which was being weaponized by Putin. So it's the weaponization of corruption. Hollowed out Ukrainian army in 2014, hollowed out under Yanukovych, led to the loss of Crimea and Donbass. Putin has also weaponized his oligarchs, who are all part of his kleptocratic network, by implanting them in the West. And we can even ask about, you know, whether the poor, in fact, it's becoming obvious that the poor performance of the Russian army currently is largely due to corruption within it. Let me just make clear, and I can give more than another talk about corruption and its patterns, but what I'm getting at here is not so much an individual, you know, you give me an envelope and I vote, you know, I let your daughter into Penn State or something like that, right? That those one-off quid pro quo things, that doesn't really matter. And in a healthy society, they're caught, or enough of them are caught, and people are punished and stuff like that. I'm talking about the operating system of integrated networks. And by integrated, I mean, and I saw this in Afghanistan, and you'll see it and I've seen it elsewhere, the cop on the street who's shaking people down, or the doctor or the teacher, they take part of what they extort from people, but they pay part of it up the line. And I've watched this. I've watched the customs, you know, collector of the customs agents collect the share that goes up to the next guy, all the way up the line. And in Afghanistan in 2010, which was the last time there were bribery surveys, I think, it was between $2 and $5 billion a year extorted in bribes. Two different surveys came up with two different numbers, but it wasn't, do you think this country is corrupt? It's, have you had to pay a bribe in the last month? how much did you have to pay? It was like that. So it's still people's estimates, but that's why you get the discrepancy. But we're talking a gigantic revenue stream being, so that's the vertical integration is the money going upward in return for protection going downward. And that's why when there was an anti-corruption push a little bit in 2009-10, you saw President Karzai intervening personally to release from jail and from prosecution really low-level, unimportant people. And he was very skillful in sending two opposite messages to two different audiences at the same time, where he would give a big anti-corruption speech and he would, show the internationals, I'm taking this issue seriously, but then he would say, the problem isn't arresting people, the problem is having better laws. And he had two notoriously corrupt and bloodthirsty warlords on either side of him when he was giving this speech, which sends the opposite message to his network, which is to say, these are my buddies, these are who I stand with, and I'm not arresting anybody. And I'm gonna tie the internationals up with endlessly writing new laws, which they love to do, sit in their offices and write new laws. So that's what I mean by corruption. And these networks are sophisticated, they're integrated, they're adaptable, and they are bent on self-enrichment. A couple of military parallels, the use of plausibly deniable proxies. Now, what's really interesting is Pakistan was way cleverer than Russia. Pakistan never invaded directly. It stuck with its proxies, whereas Russia, eventually went whole hog. Taking the population hostage. That's what I meant by, in the case of Ukraine, it's much more direct, but that's what I meant by these economic hostage-taking measures, but also, the difficulty in getting out these days. I have a friend who he needs a marriage license in order to complete his US visa application, and he can't get his marriage license because they don't want him to leave. The skillful use of deterrence. I've often felt that Pakistan, with its nukes, is kind of walking around like a country-sized suicide bomber. If you get too mad at me, I'll blow myself up, And that's just what Russia is doing, both with potential tactical nuclear use and with the nuclear power plant. Isn't this interesting? How are these two countries treated in US policy? After I've run through these parallels, it's pretty bloody amazing. So I'll leave it there, and I'd love to take any thoughts or questions that you all might have.
What are the United States? We don't necessarily have these roots of corruption. We would in the, say, 20th century or 19th century with the state mafia.
Well, then just one sec. Since we have people on Zoom, if you could push that button, then they will, no, hold it down, then they would be able to. So you have to hold it while you're talking.
So in the United States, we don't necessarily have these roots of corruption. We may have had it with the mafia. And so what I'm trying to get at, on the one hand, is a society that seems to not tolerate corruption. What is it about both the Russian and the Afghani societies that somehow, what's missing?
So my most recent book is called On Corruption in America and What is at Stake. So I challenge your premise to begin with. And what I would say is that, in fact, what I found researching that book, what I suspected was that I would find similar patterns of corruption to the ones that I had found, not just in Afghanistan, but in Nigeria, in Serbia, in Nepal, in, and what I found is, number one, that in what we call the Gilded Age, the patterns were identical. I mean, scarily identical. So guess where I'm being put up for this talk? At a place called the Carnegie House. So Carnegie was one of them. Morgan, what I discovered is J.P. Morgan got his start war profiteering. He bought defective rifles from the United States Army, rifled them, basically added a rifling to the bore, and sold them back for 4 or 5 times the price. They were the ones that you load by kind of breaking them open, and they would spit fire backwards. So he resold defective guns to the US military, a lot of these guys. Another one was running cotton. Filene, I think he sold it to Filene's in Boston. He was running cotton that was Confederate cotton. He was buying it and running it north, and then turning it into the cloth that was used for Northern Army uniforms. Anyway, the point being, the networking during the Gilded Age was almost identical. The capture of the instruments of US government power. So you had, for example, the railroad's attorney became the attorney general, and then started using court orders to make it possible for railroad workers to strike, things like that. I mean, it was the use of the US military resources against striking workers. It was absolutely, and here's what really blew me away, is that not only was this going on in America under both political parties, it was going on across the industrialized world, regardless of political system. So you had the German Empire, the French Republic, the English constitutional monarchy, and us were all functioned under the same political economy, which was essentially the capture of government powers for the enrichment of a very small group of what we would now call the super rich, of billionaires, who had so much money they literally were rolling cigarettes in $100 bills and smoking them. What I would say is what brought that phase to a close was the combined calamities of First World War, Second World War, Great Depression, Spanish flu, that's 2 genocides, use of the nuclear bomb, then starting around 1935, both in the United States and Europe, you are starting to get some curbs put on this kind of behavior, both in terms of antitrust enforcement, minimum wage, all of that, social safety net stuff and everything like that. And that continues, and various other struggles against the super rich are able to gain some foothold over the next 40 or 50 years. In 1980, we start turning around again. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying, I think our country today is systemically corrupt. And I think that the real lesson of the Afghanistan fiasco is not to do particularly with American foreign policy. It's that Afghanistan is an exaggerated mirror of us. I mean, think about the Kabul bank crisis, right? When a bank melts down and it's got basically a $900 million hole in it. Well, who established the banking system in Afghanistan? It was a bunch of people from the US financial sector who had been incubating a bubble in the United States, which resulted in the crash of 2008. So then what happens 2 years later? There's a crash in the in the Afghan banking system, it may be a little bit more in your face in Afghanistan, but it's actually pretty parallel. So that's my answer.
So do you think there, just follow that up, so do you think there is do you think there's an invariant with regard to the culture that you've just described across cultures, across time, and then some kind of value aspiration that we...
Money.
No.
The love of money. When I'm really serious, it's not money itself, which is neutral. It is the love of money. That is to say, when the amount of zeros you have in your bank account becomes the primary marker of social status, you're going to get systemic corruption. And during the period from about 1935 to about 1980, it wasn't. People didn't compete over money. They competed over other markers of social standing. And now we're back to competing over money around the world. But all of this is on corruption. So that I didn't tell Barmason, I didn't tell these folks to have that one because I didn't think it was relevant. But it's the whole discussion is in there. And then get in touch with me. Sir. Push the button, yeah. And hold your finger on it.
Well,
There you go.
Thanks a lot for the provocative comparative parallel that you drew. I appreciated that, but at the same time, I think the point you made about Afghanistan, its specific space, the nature of it, as you described, wall, two doors. But the Ukraine space is quite different. It has a different other side to it than Iran for Afghanistan. So I'm intrigued, but not totally sold on the comparison. But I do want to push the question of borders in a few different directions with you, if I may. The first really has to do with your unique position between the border of academic activity and government, or let's just call it intelligence activity. You can share certain information with us. I'm sure that you are not, or the discussions that you've had in other contexts sort of don't filter here, at least directly, immediately. And I wonder if, in this regard, you can speak to any of the classification regimes for security agencies working in Afghanistan. First border, academic and intelligence. Second border is between the United States and Pakistan. And that relationship, as you just have it characterized there, is quite complex. Like all policies, there's an overt and covert dimension. And the covert relationship between the United States and the ISI, that is the CIA and the ISI, renders some complications to the independent action of the ISI for Pakistan, okay? And the final border that I'd like to hear some discussion, because of your unique position, is this relationship between overt and covert warfare, and the really dangerous anti-democratic trend that covert warfare is posing, and the corruption involved in covert warfare. I'd like you to speak to that as a cultural component of the United States and its foreign policy.
For sure. So great questions. And I may have to, and as you've seen, I'm not a short answer kind of gal, so apologies for that. But number one, I didn't say identical, I said parallel. So obviously the topography in the case of Ukraine is very different, but I still feel that there is something interesting in that cusp area that it occupies. So number one was covert, what was number one?
Well, academic intelligence.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And in fact, when I worked for Stan McChrystal, when he was ISAF commander in Kabul for a year. And guess whose office I sat in? And I'm not quite sure why, except I have some suspicions as to why. Mike Flynn. So Mike Flynn, that one, who at the time was Stan McChrystal's head of intel. So I'm sitting in the office. There was Mike, there was his Australian deputy, and there's me, and I'm like desk to desk with Mike Flynn. So I saw a fair amount of intelligence that he was very horizontal in how he shared intelligence. He had other shit going on that I suspected but didn't poke into, because there was a really dodgy guy that he would hang out with, and they would go somewhere else to talk and stuff like that. On the intel that I did, a Brit, it was a Brit. I can't even, right, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, but, right. It was fascinating to me to sort of have a semi-window on the intel world, in particular to see how limited it was. Because of course, none of these people spoke Pashto. None of these people could hang out with anyone. I would see a product, you know, which I would then annotate and say like, well, that's wrong, and you know, so and so and so and so. And then I would get back stuff like, could you give us the source number for, and I'm like, source number? Like, these are my friends, like, no, you know, like, I mean, it would be like this is stuff I knew from hanging out with people and having conversations with them and stuff like that. I would say also that, and this is probably the reason that I was put in Flynn's office, although it didn't feel that directive, is I believe in my First Amendment rights and stuff like that. So Thieves of State, technically, I should have run that by, you know, a government, whatever the hell. And because I had signed a contract saying I would, well, I gave it to my boss, the chairman of Joint Chiefs. I gave it to Mike Mullen. He wasn't chairman anymore, but I mean, there was stuff that happens in his office in that book. So I'm like, Mike, would you read this and see whether I'm endangering national security? And he did, and he said, no, you're not. And therefore, I felt like it was okay. So just to say, like, I didn't respect those boundaries a lot. And I actually found that our intelligence was really poor, And I don't want to sound like someone who approves of the intelligence establishment, particularly as it has evolved, but a country needs a competent information gathering, you know, agency. You know, it's like that's an important function. And ours is not. And that will get to, I think, your third point, which is the way intelligence has been evolving. And it's particularly in the post 9/11 period. The CIA has turned into an operational, a killing machine. And so all the CIA was focused on was bad guys to kill. That was their objective. They were not getting any broad spectrum intelligence, from what I could tell. As for corruption, so the Kabul bank case, the guy who mentored the Afghan units who developed that case, was running into CIA front companies all over the place as he was, you know, tracing money flows. And he could see them, and he could, you know, the CIA destroyed US policy to Afghanistan. Because in the end, basically the CIA's approach was a kill bad guys approach. And anyone who in the, I want to say, in the historical current of Lansdale, who way back before the Vietnam War, you know, was advocating for democratic governments of integrity in both the Philippines and Vietnam, as the only way the US could achieve its objectives is if it was supporting democratic governments of integrity. Those of us who were advocating that approach in Afghanistan were trumped by the CIA, period. And that means, you know, both in terms of Kabul Bank, in terms of specific investigations, and in terms of the larger policy. And frankly, part of the problem was no one was able, there was never an arbitration between the two approaches. Nobody ever presented a president of the United States with a counter argument to the CIA's argument that if we kill enough bad guys, we'll win. And I remember, this sounds incredibly self-aggrandizing, so please forgive me, but I was desperate. And I remember asking Mike Mullen, would you get me half an hour with the president? Because I knew nobody, even he, couldn't quite elucidate what I was getting at. And crap, I'm the daughter of 2 lawyers, and Obama was a constitutional lawyer, and I knew I could get this across to him. I said it jokingly, and Mullen never did anything about it, but I think your point is really, really super important. And the CIA relationship with the ISI, I really do not feel, I know your suggestion is that the Americans were sort of pushing the ISI in certain directions. That was your, and I don't think so. And I actually think the ISI is a lot cleverer than the CIA. And I saw that in the early efforts to start putting feelers out to certain Taliban leaders. There was this incredible moment in 2010 when every single Talib that any Americans had put any feelers out to got arrested. I mean, it was like a sweep of a dozen or more. And, there's a reason why the bin Laden raid was not communicated to Pakistan. I mean, at least at that point, there was enough concern. And they were really, at least in the period that I was close to it, they were leading us around by the nose. But that relationship also made it really hard for the CIA to see through the ISI until it became absolutely obvious toward, the second decade of the war. Yeah. There are two here too.
There's a lot of questions popping up. I'm gonna let Ambassador Romani take, and let's try to see if we can be kind of mindful of time.
Yep.
Technically, we're supposed to end now, but I don't want to cut us off yet, so.
Thank you so much. Just following up the same discussion, I appreciate how you have described the systematic corruption. And of course, it was very real. It did not only brought the country down, but it really hampered the possibility of long-term stability, real progress, and so much more. So I am just making this point I'm not going to justify that. But all of that was really propped up not only by the overt intelligence operations, but by the entire system that this intervention brought up together. The 40 countries that went together and coordinated, they were mirroring the very image of what was happening in Afghanistan. The very corrupt people that you were talking about, they had their buddies in the Western countries that were very happy and continue to be very happy to be their interlocutor.
Yeah, and that's what I said. And I said the whole banking crisis was a mirror of the US
Not only
banking.
the CIA, not only the intel.
No, I know.
But the development agencies, the humanitarian, the NGOs, the entire system.
Yeah.
Those who were putting conditions and then overlooking at them, they were all part of this.
Yes.
The very big companies that were getting the big contracts, Chemonix, DAI, I don't know, you name it. I don't mean to single anybody out. But they were the ones that were out for real money on the books lawfully.
Yes.
In addition to everything that was happening. So this entire idea of aid and what went on and right and wrong, I agree with you that in term, Afghanistan was a security issue all along. And then everything was a byproduct of it. This was the main picture that the Western countries looked at Afghanistan and continue to do that. But then everything else that they did was also fostering this environment of corruption and instability. And I want to end with a question. You mentioned that you shared Taliban's campaign mapping.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you, which period was that? Which campaign you were talking about? That would be, there is a lot of very interesting things, and really thank you for sharing all of what you've done.
And just 100%. And I think we agree on this. What I am not trying to say is that Westerners invented Afghan corruption or vice versa, that Afghans were the only people that were corrupt. Believe me, it is certainly true that the corruption that we saw was, I would put its root even further back at the Mujahideen period, where again, there was this influx of money and weaponry into the system. And the people who were able to capture that knew that this was coming. Believe me, again, from the Karzais and their friends, I was being told in 2002 that I needed to set up a road building NGO and get contracts so that these, and I said, but I don't know how to build a road. Like, why would I do that? Oh, I'll build the road, you get the contract. So that corrupt way of behaving predated, there was no money coming in 2002 yet. So it predated, but you're exactly right that, and again, the presumption was these, and I don't want to pick on you, the gentleman who asked the first question, but the presumption was these people are just culturally corrupt. They are culturally corrupt. We are not corrupt. And I have to field that question. Your question is usually the first question every single talk I give. And I have to field it every time. And I say, look, I've been, in all of these countries, and I've never, ever, ever had somebody come up to me and say, Sarah, would you stop imposing your Western norms on us? We like this. We don't mind when the government steals from us. Like, that person doesn't exist. And you ask Afghans, ordinary Afghans, what their definition of corruption is. And it's usually a narrative, but it's with ours. It's like when you go to get some administrative work done in a government office, and they won't do it unless you pay them, your rights, and the word that this gentleman told, this is just one of the answers I got, you are trampled underfoot. I mean, it's a really strong, so the problem was that there was a presumption that Afghans are culturally corrupt, and this is just how they do things. And so, as you say, it was exacerbated, reinforced, and that's exactly the argument that I made to American officials for 10 years, is why would, from an Afghan perspective, we actively want the corruption, because that's all they could see. That's all they could see. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Campaign? Sorry.
So, campaign. Yes, the period I'm talking about was from about 2003 until about 2008, and it was particularly in the South. And I can share with you the slides later. I don't have them here, so we'll have to communicate by email. But basically, the military argument there, and this is Sally, the soap maker, gives an ops brief. I mean, it was like ridiculous, and I did it a couple of times where I really got into the details of military tactics, because I wasn't hearing, and this is before I actually worked for anyone, but I was trying to straighten up, so the presumption was, it's opportunistic. You squish the balloon here and they pop up over there. And I'm like, are you kidding? It is not opportunistic. The first point is Kandahar is a strategic objective. That was the de facto capital of the original Taliban. Kabul was just a kind of front. They were governing out of Kandahar. So you have to understand the strategic importance of Kandahar as a city, number one. And so what I had seen was an effort in toward Kandahar from the east that was blocked in like 2003, I think. And then like a full year of less activity while they reorganized themselves to come in from the south and the west. And then there was a lot of fighting to the west of Kandahar, which was then eventually blocked. Then they came back around to the north and were trying to push down. And that's when I said, don't let them into Arghand, you know, like that. So it's that. But you had to understand that Kandahar was a strategic objective, and they were going to keep organizing themselves around that. Then later, you know, so I wasn't looking again at the whole country. I was looking at what I could see. Sir.
Good morning, everyone. And I am a graduate student, and thank you for the interesting talk. And honestly saying, Taliban, they're still a global challenge. And your talk was more focused on the strategic position of Afghanistan. And like the Taliban might be, they are not challenged for their allies like Russia, Pakistan, and China. And you know that Pakistan and China, they are working on an economical corridor. They are called China and Pakistan Economical Corridor, CPEC. And I wanna listen a little bit about the global economical impact of such projects.
Yeah, one of the maps I was going to put up and then decided it was in the end a little confusing was a comparison of the first Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative. And very interestingly, they both have a corridor very similar to the one you're talking about, which is just to the east of the mountains that Afghanistan has its two doors into. So it goes right down, you know, if just over, just to the east, it's basically down the Durant line just to the east. And it's very, very significant. You're absolutely right. And it is global, especially as it's being plugged into a huge global Belt and Road network. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, in my view, to see American officials suddenly running to Africa. Oh my God, Africa's important. Why? Not because Africa, of course it's important, you know. But again, when I was in government, two parts of the world just didn't exist at all. One was Africa and one was Latin America. I mean, they just did not exist in government. And now, why do they exist? They exist because of China. And so instead of, I mean, the result is just preposterous and unfortunately lends itself to exactly the same kind of short, nearsighted policy which tends to exacerbate corruption. When you have a separate objective, government agencies and officials get very single-minded. The most important thing to do is kill Taliban. Therefore, everything else later, and on corruption, I would say, okay, you kill one Talib, but the corruption of the government that you are identified with is creating 10 more for every one you kill, because people in their indignation join the violent, opposition. And so now it's going to be, we have to get our hand on rare earth metals. We have to get our hand on these trade corridors. And China unabashedly is corrupting, is using corruption as a weapon of state. And there's always this temptation, and that's another question I hear all the time is, well, if we don't, engage in corrupt relationships with the local governments, then, what's going to happen with China? I'm like, we're not going to out China. Like, that's not our stock in trade, is to be the most effective corrupting country in the world. So let's get back to our values and use those as our, weaponize those, weaponize the values of, equal human rights, government of integrity, people having a say in their collective destiny, and let's start at home. And with that, I think I better leave us for a break. Just to say that On Corruption in America, which is not available out there, but it's got like 20 pages in the back of what regular people can do in their everyday lives to help change the incentive structure that is currently selecting for corruption in this country. And we all have to get into this fight because they've got the money, they've got the resources. All we have is the people, and we've got to the numbers. We've got to stop fighting each other over identity issues and join together against the bad guys who are the super rich. And with that, I'll leave you.